The essence of the second Hermetic principle is based on correspondence. And what that means is that there's a connection in the world of repetitive kinds of patterns going on, that they correspond with each other. Well, that's an interesting New Agey idea, except for the fact that it's based on a mathematics called fractal geometry. Geometry is the math that provides for structure in space. The geometry that we all took in school was called Euclidean geometry. If you remember, that's a geometry with squares and triangles, circles, pyramids, all these kinds of objects and structure in space. Well, it's very interesting because the Euclidean geometry is what we use to create our world today. The houses, the buildings, even the technology and electronics, etc., all comes down to understanding the geometry of a Euclidean nature. Okay? Well, here's the issue. That geometry does not create nature, and we use it to make our technology. Is there a geometry that makes a tree? Is there a geometry that makes a snail? Yes, there is. And it turns out it's called fractal geometry. Now, fractal geometry was conceived around 1900. And the significance of it is that it's based on a simple equation. It's just simply multiplication and addition. It's a very simple equation. But here's the nature of the equation, that you solve the equation and you get an answer. But the neat part is now you take the answer and feed it back into the same equation, solve it again. You get another answer. Take that answer, feed it back in. It's an iteration. It's a repeat of the same pattern over and over again using, guess what? The same original formula. Interestingly, when this new math was understood by the mathematician Julia, it takes thousands of iterations. That's the repeat of the experiment of taking the answer, putting it back into the equation, solving it, take the answer, put it back in. It takes thousands of those mathematical equations before you can even plot what the structure would look like in the geometry. Well, obviously, Julia back in 1900 couldn't do this. He would have to be doing equations day and night for 100 years to get enough data points to see what the result was. So he had an idea of what it could be, but Julia himself never even saw what a fractal produced. It actually was first recognized in the early 1980s by another mathematician, Benoit Mandelbrot, who was working for IBM. That was the key. IBM had the computers that can iterate the equation over and over and over again, thousands of times in a very short period. This allowed Mandelbrot to put in a fractal equation and then sit back for a very short time, and then see what that geometry produced on the screen. Well, it blew Mandelbrot away, because what he saw was nature, that the geometry that came from the fractal represented nature. It could be a tree, you could see a tree, or you could see an animal, or any of the structures of nature. Nature is designed on a fractal geometry. Well, that's really cool, but here's the better part. Since you're using the same equation, the patterns in the geometry repeat themselves at higher or lower levels of organization. If you're trying to understand a pattern at a higher level of organization, then you could go back and look for the same pattern at a lower level of that mathematics, make sense out of it at the lower level, and then take that information and understand the higher level. It comes down to something you've heard your whole life. It's called as above, so below. So basically, you can see the structure of the universe in patterns that replicate in self-similar fashion at any level of organization. It's a very simple one that I work with all the time is cell biology. You could look at the human and say, look at all the functions in this human body. Wow, that's very complex, 50 trillion cells in a single nucleated cell in your body. All the functions that you have in your body are already present in a cell. The cell has respiration, digestion, excretion. Cells even have an immune system. And so basically, what's the important point? Well, a human is very hard to study because of the complexity of 50 trillion cells. But if you look at a single cell and see how the process occurs, digestion or respiration, it's the same mechanism that's used in the higher organization, which is then a human body. Do I have to study the human to see how it works? I say, no. You can study a cell because it's going to have the same pattern of behavior and function associated with it that you can then transpose from the cellular size up to the human size. Correspondence. In other words, there's a repetition in the structure from as above to below, not a New Age idea, but a fundamental principle in fractal geometry. Now, an interesting point about it is, as far as we know, fractal geometry came into awareness in the 1980s with Mandelbrot. Well, obviously, 5,000 years ago, they obviously knew it as well, which then says, how smart are we, or how smart were the people that gave rise to us? This is an important part for looking at the nature of the Hermetic principles.